So India is going to be one of those countries that is ground zero. And as probably the country which is ground zero because of its having the largest population in the world. And a lot of that is vulnerable. It's going to be along coastlines and it's going to be affected by flooding. But if I had to mark two things, I would actually not pick the flooding and the extreme events. I think we're not looking at the slow disasters so much in climate change, of course, as the fast disasters and then the slow disasters, which we're not thinking about as much in terms of adaptation. But the slow disasters are heat stress and the fact of that water is running. I don't see how we can have a degrowth story, for instance, because there are all of those people to take care of. And I don't see how with a growth story we're going to protect the forests that we have. So a lot of it is politically a huge challenge. Even if you have the right thinking people and the right attitudes, there are in some of these places no win-win solutions. And so what are you going to trade off against what?
Today I'm joined by Dr. Harini Nagendra from Azim Premji University in Bangalore. Dr. Nagendra is the director at the Research Centre at Azim Premji University and leads the university's Centre for Climate Change and Sustainability. Dr. Nagendra is known for her research spanning over 30 years on forest conservation, urban sustainability, and with several seminal publications in both areas of her work. Her interdisciplinary work on forests combines remote sensing, biodiversity studies, and institutional analysis, and is recognized for elucidating the link between the patterns and processes in the human-dominated landscape of South Asia. Thank you very much for joining me, Harini.
A pleasure to be here, Xavier. We've been working back and forth on dates, but it's nice that we can finally start.
Yes, absolutely. Well, look, first question, and I'm not going to start with an easy question. What is your story? How did you arrive at the place you are today? Or how did you end up being the lead at the Center of Climate Change and Sustainability?
Okay, so this will require a bit of a long story. So let me start with that. So interestingly enough, my PhD is in ecology, and that's really the lens through which I view sustainability and climate change. But I didn't come to ecology in a sort of a conventional way. Many of my friends, colleagues who are working on ecology were nature watchers or went on bird watching, used to go on hikes. No, I sort of came to it in a very different way. And I'll have to give you a bit of background to tell you why. So I did my undergraduate degree in Bangalore in St. Joseph's College at Bangalore, which was part of Bangalore University. And we had triple majors. So my majors were not at all related to sustainability. They were microbiology, chemistry, and zoology. And then I finished and joined the Indian Institute of Science, which is India's premier institution working on science research. And I joined for an integrated PhD in biological sciences. And when I joined, I was the first batch. So this is way back in 1992 when I joined. And so it was a master's and a PhD together. And there were only 3 of us in the batch. And so we had the opportunity, because we were the first batch, to go across the 7 different departments that were in the area of ecology. And one of them was the Center for Ecological Sciences. But I didn't do anything with ecology. I didn't have ecology on my horizon. I was very interested in evolutionary biology, but not in ecology yet. And I started off with a project which was molecular biology. So looking at cloning, microbiology, working in the lab, something my past training had equipped me for, something I loved reading about. And then I found I absolutely hated lab work. It was very depressing. You spend 18 hours in the lab, you go in before the sun shines, you get out when it's dark, and lab experiments work or don't work. And I was horrified. It was not me. I was also very worried at that time that I was burning a lot of money. I was using restriction enzymes, an ml, a single ml of that costs a lot of money. And this is Indian taxpayers' money. Right. So this is not to say one should not do molecular biology work. I'm not saying that. But for me, I was really questioning what is the impact of something like this, especially when experiments don't turn out the way you want them to, and you're burning through money. So I was thinking of quitting at that time. And the Center for Ecological Sciences, which is where I ended up doing my PhD, was having a 10-year, so it was 10 years old then, and they were having a 10-year celebration. And W.D. Hamilton, who's a very well-known evolutionary biologist, now no more, was giving a talk, and I had read about his work in an evolutionary biology course I was doing. Since I liked evolution, I said, I'm going to go listen to Hamilton. But as luck would have it, they were running behind schedule, and I landed up listening to Madhav Gadgil, a professor of ecology in India, who's really one of the world's leading scientists in ecology. And Madhav was giving a talk on the issue of doing science that is relevant to the Indian context, that makes a difference to the lives of everyday people. And I was blown away, because that's exactly what I was thinking about. And that's one of the things that really was worrying me very deeply about what I was doing. So I went up to him and I said, can I join you for a second project and maybe for a PhD? And he was nice enough to take me, despite the fact that I had zero background in what I was doing. So I landed up doing a project and then a PhD with him, teaching myself ecology, teaching myself some computer science and coding, because we didn't have software for what I wanted to do, teaching myself remote sensing, satellite remote sensing, because I was looking at forest change in the Western Ghats, teaching myself landscape ecology and statistics. So it was a huge learning curve. I was extraordinarily fortunate that he allowed me to come in and hit the ground running. And in a sense, that sort of shaped my career. I'm not at all formally trained in most of the things I do now, but that doesn't daunt me, because I think interdisciplinarity became a natural for me, because I was very young and I didn't know what I was doing. And if I knew, maybe I wouldn't have done it. But I felt I could pick up things. And so I moved from there. I finished my PhD with Madhav, and then was looking for postdoctoral opportunities. And Indiana University, where Elinor Ostrom, so for those of your listeners, most would know her, but if anyone doesn't, she was the first woman to ever win a Nobel Prize in economics for her work on collective action, which is on communities and their role in protecting the environment. And I like to say I'm somewhat of an optimist who looks at sustainability problems. I think most of us who are here are optimists, because really, there is no planet B. And so we have to do something to fix the problems of the world. What I realized during my PhD was I really enjoyed the remote sensing and the looking of forest change and the landscape ecology and the biodiversity that I was doing, and the science part of it. But I was missing something very important, which is the social science. And you can clearly see when you're looking at, so my PhD looked at the entire Western Ghats, which is a 1,600 kilometer forest mountain chain and one of the world's biodiversity hotspots. And what is very clear is some areas are deforesting and degrading and disappearing, but other areas were actually being protected, regrowing, regenerating, right? So again, deep history, like I'm saying, but I realized that a lot of the whys were human. Why do people choose to protect forests in some places and destroy them in others? And so the Indiana University had a postdoctoral opportunity open, and they wanted someone to set up their South Asia research in Nepal. And I wanted to do work that was relevant to my South Asian context. So I joined them, and I was the South Asia research coordinator for the Center for Study of Institutions, Population and Environmental Change, which Elinor Ostrom had set up. So I landed up working with her, learning about institutional analysis and political science and incorporating elements of that in my work. And then in 2003, I moved back to India. My father he passed away at the end of 2003, but he had been diagnosed with cancer, and I knew he needed help. So I moved back to India, and my husband was always in India. So we were anyway doing a long distance thing. But I moved back for my dad primarily, and was there till he passed away, and then was trying to figure out what to do. So I started I got a couple of independent fellowships, one from ETH in Zurich, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. It was a Branko-Weiss fellowship. And again, one of those, I think serendipity played a huge role in my choices of sustainability. So Branko-Weiss was one of Switzerland's richest men, and was very interested in running a fellowship for life scientists, interested in looking at engagements with society. And it was perfect for what I was looking for. So I could move back to India, work on problems of my choice, and I chose to look at this central problem. What makes human beings conserve forests? Looking at a reforestation paradigm. And what are the design principles or the kinds of facilitating conditions that lead people to actually conserve forests? So I started looking at that. But towards the end of that period, that ran from 2003 to 2008, in 2008, I moved to a Government of India fellowship called a Ramanujan Fellowship, which is also independent. But during that time, I got very interested in urban ecology, which is a lot of what I do now. And part of the reason is being from Bangalore, moving back to Bangalore, I saw a city, which is a city of ecology, change a lot. A lot of the trees were cut down, the lakes were filled in, there was economic progress, economic growth, undeniable prosperity, but also a lot of ecological degradation. And I saw that ecologists don't study cities. I mean, this is true worldwide, but especially in India, a lot of the ecologists then were looking at forest areas, and fair enough, I loved looking at the forest, but I thought someone should start studying cities. And it draws back to my original motivation to work on sustainability, right? Because I wanted to work on policy relevant areas where I could contribute. But my work from, let's say, 1993, when I moved to working with Madhav, all the way till 2006, when I started urban ecology, taught me that you need to live in the context where you're working, often, to contribute. Not always, but often. And so my urban work in Bangalore started as a resident, as a parent. My daughter was born in the end of 2007, as a citizen of the city, as someone who's an activist trying to restore lakes or contribute to the protection of trees. And it's a very different way of entering research, very different from my forest research. So I would say almost transdisciplinary. So I really entered this with multiple hats, and that's something I always try to be conscious of so that bias doesn't creep in. And I'd be happy to talk about that more. But so my Government of India fellowship ran till 2013. And then I was looking for what to do. And traditional academia has not appealed to me a lot in many places, because not always, it depends on the place, but in many places, especially in India, science is kept separate from social science and social science from the humanities. And I've always approached this as a problem-focused issue. I write personally. I feel like writing is a very important part of public communication, and that's something that is very core to my identity. And I wanted a place that would just encourage all of these interests. And so Azim Premji University had an opening at that time, and I came here. So I started working there at the School of Development, setting up a lot of the sustainability work, sustainability teaching programs. And in 2019, the university decided to invest a lot of money and resources and in making climate change and sustainability one of the core mission goals of the university. And so I set that up. It's a Center for Climate Change and Sustainability. We now have 8 faculty. We're growing. We've started an environmental science and sustainability undergraduate program in India, which is very unique because it links the social sciences and the sciences of the humanities. And we have a lot more plans. So I'd be happy to talk about any of this. But that's the long story of the journey.
Well, I'm glad you showed us the full movie as opposed to just the snippet, right? Because it gives you a much fuller and richer sense of who someone is, where they came from, and their interests, right? Something that I sense from speaking to you is the importance of the need of giving back to a place that you consider home, somewhere that you feel you're very connected to. And this is particularly relevant and part of the reason I reached out to you specifically, because India for me is a place that I consider very much home for me. Some viewers may be familiar, but I grew up most of my life in India. And so in spite of my accent and my skin color, I'm very much Indian at heart. But I think in terms but in terms of issues pertaining to India, living now in a Western context, it seems India in many regards, not only in regards to science, but many other regards, is often underrepresented in many other ways. But what interests me particularly is how climate change, how sustainability, how ecology all are going to have huge impacts on India. Given population size, given where it sits in the equator in terms of heat and all those sorts of other problems, which I definitely don't know enough about. But I'd love to take this moment to sort of give you an opportunity to share one aspect, one fact, one wisdom with the outside world that may not be familiar with India. If you could only share one thing about India to give listeners, viewers, an idea of what India is like, or in regards to its environment, what would you share with the viewers?
I would share the sort of often people tend to think where you have a large density of people. India is now the most populated country in the world, and that's probably the first thing that anyone who doesn't know any India will think of. And so it is the most densely populated country in the world. It's the country with the largest growth rate. But what you find in the sustainability context is within this density, where you would think that people should be most focused on individual progress, there is so much of a sense of a collective and so much a sense of living with nature as a part of you. And this is something I mean, of course, I'm Indian and have always, most of my professional life has been work in India. But this is still something that surprises me and continuously is where I draw a lot of my optimism from. The fact that it is it's a nation with such a collective ethos and identity, and an identity that is so closely linked to nature. So I really feel Indian solutions for sustainability, and some of them are deep historical solutions, have a lot to show the world.
Absolutely. And how much do you think of that collective nature as a result of ecological factors? I recently read a book by a neuroendocrinologist called Behave, which is quite popular. And he talks about how, for example, in China, a lot of the collective cultural norms are in some sense related to the practices of growing rice, for example, which is something that's deeply ecological. How much do you think that India's ecological history informs our understanding of contemporary India?
I think it should much more than it does. But you're right. I think a lot of it is ecological. Again, speaking of my former professor, Madhav Gadgil, he and another historian, Ramchandra Guha, wrote these two very fundamentally important books on ecological history. And one, which basically talked about how a lot of the community and collective identity of India is in fact derived from its ecology. People have lived in forests for years. And of course, when you live and work in forests, it's always collective. So many of the indigenous communities that still continue to live in Indian forests are, do everything as collectives, whether it's agriculture or forest clearing or harvest or sale or feasts and marriage celebrations and mourning rituals and everything. Similarly, agriculture. The practice of hiring labor is something that's fairly new in India, and typically people contributed collective labor. So you went to work in someone's field during harvest or during sowing, and someone would work in your field. Irrigation would be done the same way. So there are these links that really meant you had to depend not just on your neighbors in your village, but let's say it's irrigation along a river. So you also depended on all the villages along that river. Or if it was collective agriculture in a larger region, then you depended on that, or a larger forested region. So a lot of it is ecological, and there have been cultural and spiritual traditions that reinforce a lot of this. So prayers to local gods and goddesses, which are often animist traditions, which survive in the heart of, even in the heart of modern cities in India today, really reinforce and maintain these traditions. So I think it's a core part of that. Coming back to your question though, how much did that inform the way we think? A lot of what my research shows, and this is not new, others have shown this too, is that somewhere we have a collective amnesia for certain kind of deep history. We have, of course, like we have revisionist histories elsewhere in the world, we have them in India too, but, we have a collective amnesia of the kind of deep history we need to have, because certain things like, for instance, smart city paradigms or other things that are in the West are very quickly pushed into Indian policy sector or Indian planning or by corporate groups. And we don't think of what are the homegrown solutions that we could be thinking of.
And being someone that's lived in India for a very long time and coming to a Western city like Sydney, I think it's similar to the point you made earlier about your professor, or I think it was a PhD supervisor, Madhav, that said that you have to live in the context to really have an understanding of ecological, having important ecological solutions. India, in my view, is so vastly different, so vastly diverse, and so unique in that, in every sort of conceptual way, in my opinion. And part of that is because of the scale. So one quote I love by Amartya Sen, he says, "Whatever you can rightly say about India, the opposite is also true." Right. That's something it really deeply resonates for me in my experience. But I think there's definitely a tendency in terms of in the West to sort of impose Western solutions onto an Eastern context, which is not compatible in the slightest. Or if it is, it's very technocratic, and it sort of fails to appreciate the complexities and the nuances of Indian society. Or I mean, even in China or other countries. What is your experience in terms of observing? Being someone that went over to Indiana, for example, did your PhD, sort of was inculcated in another context, and sort of hearing the views of scientists on perhaps your own country. What's that experience like? And do you think that there's a fundamental misunderstanding of how India can progress with environmental problems?
I've been fortunate where I have collaborated. I have a lot of collaborations with the colleagues in India and in the US, for instance, but also in Europe and Australia and a number of other places. I have to say I've been fortunate because the global environmental change community, which I'm a part of, is actually very aware of these challenges and has been arguing for a long time that we shouldn't universalize solutions to problems. There are things like climate change, which are global, but even then they play out in very different ways in different parts of the world. And so I think in that sense, in academia, I have not faced a challenge of how to communicate these ideas. I find people are very open and often they realize that there's a lack of knowledge and they want more of these kinds of cross-country linkages and discussions. I think it becomes more of a problem in the global policy space when you have institutions like the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank or other big economic players funding this, or corporate groups, or now a lot of, in fact, the funding on sustainability comes from philanthropy, very large philanthropies. And so they often come in with agendas, or they come in with views which may not be agenda driven, but views that they are experts in finding the solutions, and the same solutions will work everywhere. And maybe that's a corporate experience, speaking to the fact that because you run a company in pretty much the same way in different parts of the world, but minor few changes. And but other aspects of daily life don't work like that, and sustainability certainly doesn't. So that is where I feel there are more challenges.
Well, I'm glad at least the experts are doing good things in the field. Now,
I have to say, though, there's still that paucity of research, and that's a different issue. But there's a huge structural issue in terms of getting enough research done in broadly global South context, what you might have called a developing country context before. I really don't like the word, so I don't use it. But because in global South context, for instance, some research we did in 2019 for a Nature Sustainability paper showed us that 70% of the research on sustainable cities comes from the global North context, largely the US, North America and Europe. It's essentially the US, Canada, and Europe. Then 20% comes from China. So that's your 90%. And the rest, the India-like context. So India, South Africa, other global South countries in contexts like India, because China is a very different context, is 0.5% of the top cited papers on sustainability. And we took at a 10-year period. We didn't look at a single year. We looked at a 10-year period, the top cited papers on urban sustainability. We picked the top 1,000, which is a large sample size. And if India and countries like India represent 0.5%, and these are structural issues then, because it's an issue where you get the funding. Some of these questions are complex. They require a lot of funding. And international funding is so much geared towards, you might have collaborations, but the collaborations will always be driven by Western counterparts because they get the lion's share of the money. So, for instance, when I've applied for these collaborative grants, it is very typical that the person in the US or in Europe will be getting, let's say, 90% of the funds. And therefore, they do the theory building. And you might be the data points that they need to add. And so that bias is there. It's not the scientists, but it's the structural aspects of this, which is the funding agencies.
And do you get a sense that this is changing with time, or do you think
it's getting worse? It's getting worse. Because in fact, things were better. Research was less expensive. It's become more high tech because you need to look at, when you look at the natural sciences components, you do need that technology. And on the other hand, a lot of the funding programs that used to fund other kinds of low-cost research in the Global South, many of them have vanished. And it's becoming much more consolidated into a few large grants. So I think it's gotten worse over time.
Yeah, this reminds me of there's this book that's come out recently by an anthropologist from Norway who has a Bangladeshi heritage. Her name is Camelia Dewan. And she's written a book called Misreading the Bengal Delta. Now, in the book, she talks about essentially how huge organizations like the World Bank funneling grants into Bangladesh specifically for climate change projects under the guise of, helping mitigating impacts of climate change. However, the the funds are used in such an unproductive way that the local communities, if they had control of these funds, they would never set up the projects as they have been set up. And so essentially it's this sort of completely misunderstanding of how to mitigate climate change, and also a very reductionist sort of view that, there's nothing we can do. The sea levels are rising, too bad, so sad. So, I mean, I'm being reductionistic by describing it that way, but she talks about that, which I find, very interesting. And so, what do you think can be done about this aside from just trying the best to do more research, right? I mean, it sounds like a structural problem requiring some sort of systems change.
Yeah. What can individuals do? I think what individuals or scientist groups could do is really encourage a lot of younger people. And this was, again, something that used to be done before. If you had a global science meeting, like so many of the global environmental change organizations, I was on the steering committee of Diversitas, for instance, which dealt with biodiversity, or the Global Land Project, which and these had funding from the ICSU and the ISSU, which are the International Science and Social Science Unions. They had actually a lot of money for these young investigator programs. Some of them which I went to, some of them which someone who got trained, some of them which I participated in as a trainer. And they were really excellent, because if I look now at a lot of the people doing the work 20 years later, many of these people were at those early conferences. So I think we need, and now you have I think you have even lower cost ways of doing this. You can do this online very well. And online has been a big boon for people like me who might not want the climate footprint of traveling, outside India to, let's say, Australia or the US 10 times a year. I might do 1 or 2 trips. And also maybe not have the budget, so you can get these young investigators. And I think really that's where we should be investing, and not people at my stage, which is, 30 years into the field, but the people who are finishing their PhDs or starting their PhDs or getting into postdocs. How do you get them to cross collaborate? But I think the one thing we need to do to change the old paradigm of, if I think back to those training institutions, those training programs that I went to, they were largely focused again on the idea that people, it's ironic, in a place like biodiversity and ecology, people from temperate countries were teaching people from the tropics about biodiversity, and the greatest biodiversity is in the tropics. Right? So I think you need to level that playing field. And I think people are a bit more aware of those nuances now. And so call them not just training or capacity building of the global south, but it's also training and capacity building of the global north to learn from the south. So, but I think there are these programs. I mean, I'm really more and more convinced that we need education, mass education, and the training of younger people, because they're going to be left with these problems. And maybe some of the ways we're thinking about these are stultified and outdated, and maybe we're not getting the scale of the problem.
Yeah, well, I think this is a good transition point to talk about perhaps how climate change is affecting India. I mean, and not only climate change, because I think there's a tendency to not talk about the other ecological disasters that are happening. But ecologically speaking, what is happening in India as a result of increased temperatures, as a result of populations moving more to cities? What is the current climate, to use a pun, of India?
Yeah. So India is going to be one of those countries that is ground zero, and as probably the country which is ground zero because of its having the largest population in the world. And a lot of that is vulnerable. It's going to be along coastlines, and it's going to be affected by flooding. But if I had to mark 2 things, I would actually not pick the flooding and the extreme events. I think we're not looking at the slow disasters so much. And climate change, of course, has the fast disasters and then the slow disasters, which we're not thinking about as much in terms of adaptation. But the slow disasters are heat stress and the fact of that water is running out. And this is really what we see. We see a lot of people in rural areas shifting to cities because agriculture is no longer profitable because they don't have the water. The climate has changed. India was always rainfall dependent in terms of its agriculture. Agriculture is still one of the main economic drivers of what happens in this country. Stock prices rise and fall. Political parties rise and fall. Their fortunes rise and fall with the rainfall. Right? And that's so critical. And we know the rainfall is erratic. So you see, and also India was a country that had traditions of rainwater harvesting, which were very water-wise, and traditions of agriculture, which were very water-wise. So millets, which don't require much irrigation, as well as you just used wells that, not bore wells, but wells that tapped into the surface water supply, tanks which were connected so that they harvested rainwater, and rivers which were sustainably used. So this entire tradition of using water very sustainably. All of that disappeared, along with the fact that the climate is changing. And so a lot of people have become temporary refugees. So they move to cities, not permanently. So the old people and the children are often left behind in the villages, and the able-bodied men and women move to the city, staying in really cramped, horrible accommodations, actually, exposed to because they live in the worst parts of the city, exposed to the heat stress, and trying to make some living, but they still go back and they have their farms. So if you have a couple of good years of rain, you find people go back to their villages. So they have this problem of, so they're climate refugees, but internal, temporary displaced climate refugees. But then you have the problem that in the city, they're living in plastic tents or aluminum sheet roofs, and then you have heat stress. And especially, so in the north of India, you often see this talked about, where you have heat waves. In the south of India, it's actually worse, and nobody's looking at that, because you have heat plus humidity. You don't get the heat that's 40, 45 degrees Celsius, but you might get 30 degrees Celsius with, let's say, 90% humidity, which could be a killer. And so you have huge amounts of heat stress, and the only way India is looking at it this far is disaster management. That is, in heat stress, maybe have SMS alerts and get them out of the heat, which you need to do. But in terms of how do you actually mitigate and help the poorest of the poor, who are already refugees from one place to into the cities, I think that's a lot that we're not thinking about. We're so focused on coastal sea level rise and flooding that we haven't thought about these issues.
And of course, given the size of the population, that is just like an extra amplification of what would already be a huge issue.
Yes.
So, I mean, obviously, all the reporting that I've seen regarding heat stresses in countries like Europe or in Australia, even, where we have bad heat waves, but countries like India, where you have 100x the population, I mean,
and no air conditioning and no electricity capacity to supply to all of these places, it's going to be very bad.
And so, it's very, very difficult. And I suppose in terms of government support, are you seeing at a local level as well as a federal level that governments are intervening with regards to environmental problems? Because I know a lot of, I'm generalizing here, India is not a monolith. There's diversity in terms of different policy actions across the nation. But are you seeing that governments are responding to environmental problems as well as, urban related problems with veracity? Or is there...
So yes and no. In terms of the national and the state governments, yes, there's a lot of interest now. India's national government has a lot of plans for climate adaptation and mitigation, very aggressive plans, for instance, on renewable energy, on tree plantation for carbon sequestration. So some very good plans. The state governments, the state government of Assam, for instance, is starting to look at issues of heat very seriously, and climate adaptation to flooding, because so much of it is hilly and there's going to be all kinds of potential landslides and other kinds of calamities. So there are state governments that are looking at these extremely seriously. Karnataka, which is the state where Bangalore is, that others might not, has been doing a lot of work in rural areas to actually strengthen the rainwater traditional arrangements that I was talking about, the tanks and the ponds and the wells, trying to get many rural areas to again revive their agriculture. So that's state-wise, there's a lot of work. Is it sufficient for the scale of the problem? No. That is still a challenge. And also the fact is that it is still not sufficiently taking to account the role of ecology. For instance, in cities, a lot of the focus is on SMS alerts and getting people into the shade, and maybe renewable energy-based air conditioning or low electricity forms of air conditioning and cooling. But, if you just planted trees or even kept the trees that you had instead of cutting them and revived your water bodies, you get a lot of natural cooling straight away. And you wouldn't need that much air conditioning. And actually, this would be the kinds of benefits that would be accessible to the rural migrants, the climate refugees I was talking about, because they're not going to be able to go indoors all the time. But if they had a tree they could sleep under or sit under in the shade of the afternoon sun, that would really help. Or if they had a water body that they could stay close to during the worst of the heats, They can't stay indoors because the indoors is worse than the outdoors, right? So you need those kinds of things. And somehow that in the rush towards defining development as economic development and infrastructure development, there's this lack of understanding that ecological infrastructure is also infrastructure.
Yeah, and I mean, in regards to environmental solutions to problems that may be exacerbated by economic policies, such as, trying to maximize the growth as much as possible, I think there's often a false dichotomy that, to do one, you can't do the other. So, for example, if you have to maximize economic development, there's no way that you can consider whether we should cut down trees in the urban context, right? And yet, I think, as you've pointed out, it's not necessarily a zero-sum game. It can be positive-sum, whereby the implementation of these solutions are not only beneficial economically, but also ecologically, and in fact may be better than the status quo, right? Do you find that there's like you were saying before, right, transdisciplinary perspectives, there's often a blind spot cognitively in policy that often negates or neglects ecological solutions?
There is a huge blind spot there. And, some of it is, we always talk about the political economy and corruption, but there are so many good public officials. So it's not just that. A lot of it is just a cognitive blind spot. And I've seen this where we talk to government officials from the Bangalore municipality. We've done training programs there. So when you talk about the ecological changes in the city and the loss of trees and the loss of lakes, they're very animated, and they're suddenly thinking as citizens and not as municipality representatives, right? Not as bureaucrats. And they will tell you things like, I grew up here, I absolutely see this. And yes, my grandmother used to do this and her life was so much better than mine in so many ways. And then you start giving them solutions, so plant more trees, or when you're restoring lakes, don't concrete pitch the sides, but use mud, or, and use vegetation or protect the wetlands for natural remediation of pollution, and a whole bunch of things. And then suddenly the planner or the bureaucrat hat comes back on. They say, you can't do that because of a number of things, which is just cognitive bias, because they've always done it they've not always done it a certain way. It might be the past 10 years that they've followed a particular approach of economic growth, but it seems like the only rational thing to do. And so I find this extraordinarily interesting. And I've now looked at, so many cities across India where you find this complete cognitive dissonance, where as individuals, they will completely agree with what you're saying. But the moment they put on this work hat, it goes awry. But, coming back to transdisciplinarity, where there has been a lot of positive change in Indian cities, it's because of citizen action. So you have a number of citizen groups that are doing things from the complete activist, on roads, hug trees, prevent cutting of trees, go to courts, approach them with public interest litigations, all the way to education and planting. So planting drives, trash cleanup, going door to door, convincing people of the need to compost waste. So it could be, each person has an appetite for something very different. And it could be for education, it could be for activism, it could be for working with the government. Many groups actually work with the government, to help strengthen their hands. And they do need to, all of these cities are under capacity in the sense they have much less finance than they need, and much less manpower than they actually can have need for, right? So, but these are really things that give you hope. So, for instance, in Hyderabad, there was a long-standing citizen protest, and it went all the way to a public interest litigation to the court, which is the Chevela banyans. So, there's a Chevela highway, and there are a number of very large, very old, centuries-old banyans that were going to go. And so this group, which is a wonderful group of people, from all walks of life, came together, counted these trees, and actually got the court to pass an injunction very recently, just a couple of weeks ago, saying that these banyans are going to be protected. And you can't cut them to widen the road. You have to find an alternative solution. So I think some of these are really progressive, because you know how it is with court rulings. Once you have a precedent, it becomes much easier for other groups to then try and save their trees in different cities.
Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting about Hyderabad, because that's the city I actually lived in, funny enough. But so going back to the dissonance that you were speaking about, there's this very interesting business paper that a professor of mine showed me, in short, I won't go into the paper in fully, but essentially the punchline is that in different contexts, people respond to things differently, and they're more receptive or less receptive to certain things. So, for example, if you prime someone if you prime someone about their job, about their salary, what they did at work, they'll be more likely to cheat. However, if you prime someone about their family life, their personal life, etc., they're less likely to cheat. Now, from a behavioral point of view, I think this is a very difficult, and even a rhetorical point of view, I think advocating for the environment is very difficult in India. And I mean, an example I'll use, this is completely anecdotal, I'm not saying statistically speaking, but a friend of mine, we were walking in a park in Hyderabad. It's called KBR Park. It's a very, very big park. And,
gorgeous one also.
Yes, it's very pretty. And, there's peacocks everywhere. There's amazing feather-like trees. It's something out of a novel, right? And I was sort of going on a rant to him, talking about, I felt bad that there wasn't more parks like this. And he said something. He said, it's very hard to focus on the environment when there's people that are doing it very tough, which is very true. And at the same time, as we were speaking about before, it's not a zero-sum game. It's a positive-sum game where everyone benefits. But I think focusing on the discipline of politics and being a bureaucrat, I think it can be very challenging to be voted again by your constituents when environment is considered in a silo and not considered amongst economic development, in amongst health policy. So it's called a wicked problem for a reason, right? So
right.
But yeah, it's very challenging.
No, and I find that very interesting, because I have heard this many times, that and you will find so in India, as you may or may not know, or at least listeners may not know, because of the under provisioning of many urban municipalities, a lot of the advice on what to do is often given by parastatal bodies. So there might be think tanks of various kinds who are influential local residents, often with corporate backgrounds. And often where you will hear this because of their exposure to certain kinds of things. And I'm not stereotyping, but it still is more often than not that they will think that they need to, I have heard this said many times, that someone who is poor will not have the time to think about these issues and care about the environment. So we need to think about it for them and keep their needs in mind. And so it's a very paternalistic sort of way of
very patronizing.
Very patronizing. But when we've actually done surveys, and my students have looked at slums and informal settlements in Bangalore and Hyderabad of street vendors, and actually, Sukanya Basu, who was a master's student of mine, has actually looked at the KBR Park and a number of other parks in Hyderabad. And we have a paper looking at that and at street vendors in Hyderabad, looking at the low-income residents who are often gated out of these parks, who now need to pay, because I think KBR now is ticketed, for instance, and you need to pay. And all of them, the poorest of the poor, whose street vendors who might be sleeping under a tree even at night, are the ones most attached to nature. And you'd find these very interesting things where they're telling you, I mean, the sort of large-heartedness is when you listen to those patronizing statements and you hear their statements, you really feel very small, I would say. So, for instance, one of the informal settlements I went to in Bangalore, and I've written about her before, a lady called Dhanalakshmi. She had this most beautiful, it was a mud road in front of her house. It's an informal settlement. It's a sort of a temporary house. She's already living in difficult conditions. They don't get water. And she had this lovely little garden, which is a road front garden, which is fenced off with thorns. And she had her own chicken, but the thorns were to prevent the chicken plucking these, and very nice biodiversity. I went back with a reporter who wanted to cover the gardens in the informal settlement a couple of years later, and the road had been tarred and she had lost her garden. And so we went into her house, and she had 6 pots on her wall with tulsi, which is the holy basil, which is sacred to many Indians, but only holy basil. And she had so much biodiversity in that little strip in front. So I asked her, I said, why do you have 6 pots of only these? And she said, no, I prepared them. I lost the garden when the road was widened. And so I wanted to replace it with these pots, which is all the place I have now. And I prepared the ground, got mud, put manure in this. And then I went to visit my married daughter. And when I came back, these seeds had blown in and tulsi was growing in all the pots. And she said, it's an uninvited guest. How can I send it away? And so with no water, with no land, this woman who is so interested in biodiversity, so knowledgeable, is growing tulsi. And I felt really small, I have to tell you, because I have a house with a garden. I'm very fortunate. And to be in a part of the city, we bought when we thought we were escaping the city so we could actually buy land. But the city swallowed us. Nevertheless, I have a large garden with a lot of trees, but I am ruthless about my trees. If something's not giving me what I want, I'm going to remove the tree and put in something else. And here she is with only her and I have water and I have the money to get water if I need to. And here's this woman with only 6 pots who is willing to leave and grow tulsi because that's what came in, and it was an uninvited guest, but a guest, an honored guest. And so when we make these statements on behalf of people, I think we need to be very careful.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm glad that there's research showing the inverse to negate such patronizing statements. And it reminds me of a podcast we did with a Marxist geographer, which is I love the combination. It's very, very unique. But he talks about he has a thesis in a book by Verso called Climate Change's Class War. Now, in the book, his central thesis is that people in the professional class, so people that work in corporate jobs or work in jobs that require some sort of higher education, often view those that come from backgrounds that don't require a degree, such as the working class people, as uneducated. And as a result, that is why climate change is a problem. So it's sort of like this similarly patronizing, if you guys, got a university degree, would we not be in this mess? And similarly, there's other political sort of tangents like Donald Trump voters and whatnot, which I won't go into. But what he says, which I find very interesting, is he says, this is a rubbish argument, because change happens where people want change to happen. And so even if there's not a large population to say that are in favor of it, if you're going to impose, in an example he uses, a what is it called? Tax on carbon, which is going to disproportionately affect those that come from poorer backgrounds, people from poorer backgrounds are not going to want the tax because it's impacting them. And then people that come from, that earn in the upper percentile of wages say, get on the high horse saying it's because they're uneducated. That's why they voted for the carbon. They voted down the carbon tax. And so I find a lot of parallels and a lot of us versus them, very instinctive answers to questions that often have very different answers. Now,
I was just reading an article in The Guardian today, and I was looking at, it's the new Oxfam report that talks about the 10 billionaires, the 10 most wealthy people of the world and their carbon footprint, which is massive because of the cruise liners and the personal aeroplanes and jets and what have you. But they were also talking about the fact that how they were, and I can't remember the climate researcher they quoted, but they had someone talking about why, speaking of your class wars, it therefore behooves politicians to choose the targets of their policies well. So France, of course, was trying to create the carbon tax, right, on fuel. And that was a disaster. But the reason it was a disaster was that so many of the poorer French people who live in rural areas need the car. And so if you're actually taxing that, you're reducing 30% of their income. And I didn't realize it was this large.
Yeah.
And so, of course, they were going to protest. And of course, this was a policy that was doomed from the start. And really, how much difference is that going to make? But if you actually tax the people who had the cruise ships or the jets or something like that, you could probably save that amount of carbon. But you wouldn't do it because it would be political disaster for you.
Yeah. And so, I encourage viewers to go listen to that podcast if you're interested in. But the argument he makes, and he references the Oxfam report, which I think is similar to what you read. He says that this is focusing on consumption side. It's focusing on individual. He argues that instead you need to focus on the production side, which is the people that are producing the carbon, that are sourcing the carbon, that knowingly, continuously extracting resources, even though they know that it, since 1978, for example, for ExxonMobil, they knew that it's going to lead to huge disasters, right? So that's his argument. But yeah, very interesting. Now, very quickly, this is in a sense connected. I'm wondering in terms of, actually, no, I'll take a step back. So there's this very interesting paper by a psychology professor in America called Jonathan Haidt. And he posits this moral framework, this theory called social intuitivism, which is a bit of a mouthful. But basically, he argues that some people, when they're making arguments, they often make an argument after they reason after the fact. So they arrive at a position based on feeling. And then after they've arrived at their feeling, they don't like something, even they don't know why, they just don't like it. After the fact, they'll rationalize, I don't like this because of this. And I find this, I see this all the time with environmental policy. People just don't like, well, in Australia, for example, people don't like vegans because, vegans are, annoying, something like that, right? And they will have all these arguments as to why vegans are a nuisance. But I think at the baseline level, you can say it's perhaps not a rational argument, it's just based on feeling. Now, in a sense, I think this sort of framework impacts a lot of environmental policy, at least from my perspective. So the rationale I give that is that for most of my life, similar to you, I did not arrive at caring about the environment in a conventional sense where I was bird watching from a young age or I was doing X, Y, Z. I grew up in urban India in the middle of cities. I love cities. Cities are a very big part of my life. And at the same time, I never really paid attention to ecology. It was never a concern of mine. I didn't really learn about it in school, unfortunately. So for me, arriving at caring about environment was something that I came through fiction, ironically. Or not ironically, but interestingly. And for me, the strongest arguments are feeling-based, at least for me. They come at this sense of wanting to be one with nature, loving nature, identifying with it, and also sensing its beauty. It's not something it's something I felt, and then I realized the importance of it in that sense. And then I was able to, learn more about climate change, and that's how I got into this podcast. But, bottom line is that I feel that perhaps people that grow up in cities, and this is all over. I mean, most populations, they live in urban cities. They're, in a sense, disconnected from environment. So they don't have a garden, or if they do, it's a very limited garden. Perhaps the extent of their connection with ecology is purchasing food, but even when they're purchasing food, most people don't know where it's coming from. They're growing with pesticides, which is not really organic. And so there's this huge disconnect between people and the environment, which between people and the environment. I'm wondering, do you think there's this cultural void where people are disconnected from the environment, specifically in India? Do you feel that's the case, or do you think that India is uniquely positioned to have a deeper connection with ecology?
Yes and no. I mean, like you said with Amartya Sen, for every person that I can show you who has a deep connection, I can show you one more who hasn't. So what we found very interesting was the informal settlements, which are very cramped. They don't have space. They don't have water to grow. But people are growing plants in almost everything. It could be an old discarded utensil, a battery can, a paint jar, all kinds of places that they would find all kinds of utensils and pot, which they convert into pots. And so they seem to be extraordinarily motivated also because they're using these as their like herbal garden, So you might grow some ginger or some tulsi for a cough or a cold because you can't afford to go to the doctor. But then the wealthier you are, the more you consume, ironically, you might get more disconnected from the environment. Maybe not so ironically, but I know a lot of people, for instance, who then would travel to national parks for tourism and then get very worried about the tiger, but not understand. And these are very intelligent people who run companies, etc. Right? So, but would not understand or think of the fact that it is their travel by air and then the road that comes because so many tourists come to this park that cuts through the park that then impacts the wildlife. Or the luxury tourism resorts that come around and then with the plastic that is associated with that and, all of the use of water, for instance, for luxury baths or hot tubs or what have you. Right. So I find that dissonance very interesting. And so, yes, you do find a lot of people in cities are disconnected from the environment now. And this is a special problem for India, which is still 33% urban only. But because of the fact that the demographic structure is so skewed towards the young, it means that most of the young are growing up, or the going to grow up in the future and become, the Indians, the leaders of tomorrow, let's say, are growing up in cities. And so I really wonder so one of the things I found, which has been very interesting, is so at the university, we run this very large climate festival, and that's part of the goals of the center, to reach young people. Last year, it was rivers of life. This year, forests. Next year, mountains. And we reach 10, 15, 20,000 young people who come in. And we do this as a celebration of nature, because otherwise a sustainability festival for the young can be very dismal and gloomy and very depressing. So we talk about serious issues, but the tone is decidedly and very deliberately positive, right? And so we use music and culture and art and workshops and painting and all of that. So, but what I found this year was very interesting. So we've got all these fabulous exhibits on. We had 130 interns that went across the country. We have all these very informative exhibits. But what I found the children very attracted to was this traditional troupe that came. It's a folk art form called Yakshagana. I don't know if you've seen it in Karnataka. They came from a part of Karnataka, and which they're doing a section from the Mahabharata. So they have Hanuman, who is the monkey god, talking to Arjuna. And it was very interesting. Arjuna was a character from one of the gods from the epic Mahabharata. And the conversation is so interesting because they wove in elements of ecology. So Hanuman is actually, so Arjuna tells Hanuman that you're backward, you're a monkey, you live in the forest, right? Man has gone to the moon. We've progressed in terms of technology, and you're using these primitive approaches. And then Hanuman goes off on this long rant about, you human beings, you have a brain, so you use the brain for good and bad purposes, and you think you're very intelligent. But I am an animal who has a simple brain, and so I use my simple brain for simple things which are always good. And the whole set of kids, we had 600 children in that audience, clapping and laughing and cheering on Hanuman. And then there was a leopard that I don't know if you're aware of, but recently there was a very tragic incident where a leopard came in from the forest around and strayed into Bangalore and made its way into a few apartments, and then had to be shot. And we are really squatting on the leopard's land, right? Because these are apartments that have moved into these peripheral areas of Bangalore where the leopards once were. So the troop brought that in also. And they talked about the loss of the leopard. And again, you saw the children on their side. And then I was really thinking, do we need all these exhibits? Of course, you need the knowledge that comes with them. But maybe what you just really need is a troop like this that goes from school to school and involves them in folk art about the Mahabharata, which is their own epic, about the gods that they know and they're familiar with, and uses those age-old classic stories to tell themes of today. Because epics are all, whichever language, whichever tradition, right? An epic is an epic because it speaks to everything. Shakespeare is Shakespeare because it speaks to all human condition, right? So these are beautiful stories, and if you can use them to then riff off and connect to ecological themes or sustainability themes, I think that would be far better, frankly, as an educator. So I've been thinking about this, and I think as scientists, we only see a small slice of this puzzle.
Yeah, no, of course. It's very beautiful how the epic how it changes over time, and it focuses on certain themes in different ways, and how ecology has come to the forefront. I find that very, very beautiful. And I think on a similar note, I'm interviewing someone very soon who's a climate scientist, but in their spare time, they do slam poetry. Very interesting. And I had a look at some of their videos online, and it's all about science, the poetry as well, but it's in such a way that I would much rather listen to them go on for hours about in poetry rather than an academic discourse, right? And then I think in a way it sort of speaks to some sort of different element, some sort of it's very hard to say. So for example, I mentioned that fiction was very useful to me, specifically as a American writer called John Steinbeck. Now I think his writing on ecology is just the most gorgeous prose I've ever read. I mean, mind you, I've not read a lot of fiction, but there's some connection. I'm not quite sure what it is yet, but I think humans at a fundamental level, our currency is storytelling. We connect deeply with stories, and I may as well drop this in now that it's also important to mention that you're also a literary author, as I understand. In your spare time, a successful literary author, which is amazing. But I mean, speaking of your literary work, have you found any interesting insights from having writing fiction stories in your spare time, how to communicate ideas or concepts or I'm not sure, sort of narratives. Has that helped you in any way in your scientific endeavors?
Yes, and so interestingly, so what and my so my the mystery fiction that I write is set in 1920s Bangalore. And the reason I go to the 1920s Bangalore, because it's the ecological core of the city I love most in the world, which is the time that it was a city of trees and lakes, but it was also a city where communities thrived. And for me, that association of collectives and ecology is really very strong. And that's I guess normatively my idea of a good world, a good society, where people from whatever faiths, whatever economic backgrounds, whatever gender, what the entire spectrum, whatever backgrounds they are, regardless of identity, can come together and work in collectives and work with nature, right? Work in an environment surrounded by nature. So very much, I think that's the reason the spare time, the non-existent spare time in which I write these books is my real escape. It's my escapist. I often joke with my husband because the first book was published when I turned 50, and I joke with him often that this is a midlife crisis, and it's a good midlife crisis maybe to have. But it is a time that you start thinking about the meaning of life and things like that. And so this is my escape back into a gentler, kinder, more beautiful time that I think we can learn a lot from. My ecologist friends, whether in India or different parts of the world, very interestingly say that they can make out that an ecologist wrote it. And I never thought of it that way. In fact, I had a lot more ecology in the first round of the books. And over time, with editor inputs and my own, sort of getting more used to this, I've realized that I shouldn't put in too much of a heavy dose of ecology because it overwhelms the story. So I've actually taken out a lot of the ecology that I want. Yeah. But my ecologist friends can always say, I mean, they all say that I know that it was you who wrote it. And, I could make out that someone was. So yes and no. Now, in terms of how it has informed my ecological style of writing, I would say it's taught me to think of how to communicate outside the choir. So we're always preaching to the choir. And one of the things that I've deliberately done is and I've just got, for instance, another non-academic book called Shades of Blue, which is on water in Indian cities out. And this is the third book that I've written on nonfiction, on ecology for the public. But I think I'd like to think that I've become better at tackling more complex issues using simpler language. And that's, I realized, the thing that my fiction has taught me. How to use the simplest, as academics, you tend to use jargon. And I think it's just baked into us. How to use the simplest language, but also connect it to all the sensory aspects that people think of. Like we've got a story of spies who are mapping water systems, or mythical monsters, and we've got this whole thing of Loch Ness, and was Loch Ness real, or the Loch Ness monster real or not? And that's the hook that pulls people in. So make the threads more complex, but use the language very simply. And I think that's really the key to successful storytelling, whether it's fiction or non-fiction.
Yeah, of course. And I think touching on that very briefly before we start wrapping up is that I think if you're, picture that you're standing around a campfire, someone starts telling a story, no one understands the story. What is the outcome? No one cares. I think that is fundamentally why I think literature, or why all poetry, humanities, even why they're so critical, is that, without being able to communicate your ideas in a way that captures people's imagination, enchantment, being in awe of these things, I think it's very hard to get people on side. And I think that comes back perhaps to that social intuitivism idea that people act a lot on feelings. One thing that I came to discover quite recently, there's a Australian politician named Bob Brown. Now, he's very well renowned in Australia and perhaps even in international circles. I'm not quite sure, but essentially he was a general practitioner, a doctor in Australia, who lived on this island of Australia called Tasmania. And when he was in his 30s or 40s, there was this landscape in Australia called the Tarkine, I think. It's basically a forest, a wide rainforest that was being logged. Now, Australia has a very bad logging problem whereby people, businesses and whatnot, log the areas, even if it's areas where They're very old trees.
Mm-hmm.
And he took a stand, and he ended up doing a very large, citizen protest. And he gained such popularity that he started the first Green Party in the world. And that's where I think Green parties originate in a formal
Mm-hmm.
sense. Obviously, being Green parties have existed probably in all forms,
Mm-hmm.
informally all around the world for centuries. But in a formal sense, I think that was the first political party globally, if I'm not mistaken. Now, I mean, given what we've all spoken about, I mean, you've mentioned how certain constituents are very receptive and often need the environment. It's an ecology, and it plays a very important part of their lives. And yet, from what I understand, I don't think India has a green party that is of a large size, as I understand.
Yeah.
Now, I'm wondering, do you think this is politically viable in India, or perhaps in Karnataka you can speak to? And yeah, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
So I don't know because
Sorry, even just before that, perhaps I should clarify. Green Party, a party whereby the environment is at the center of its policy aims, amongst other policy aims, but primarily focusing on protection of environment. Anyways, sorry.
I have no idea. I mean, how all of this will play out in the future. For instance, one of the things, and this is not just for India, I had thought, let's say 5 or 10 years ago, was that as people become more aware of climate change, there will be an increasing interest in green parties. What you actually see is that the world over, there's an increase in fascist parties and in the far right, and in people who are not in political parties that actively mock or deny the existence of climate change. Right? So this is something I realize I was wrong, and in hindsight, it seems obvious why, but I didn't expect it. Now, in India, you don't see green parties. You also don't see green agendas taking a very important center stage. It's still issues of poverty and basic human rights and necessities and economic growth, and probably fair enough because given the population size of the population and the issues we have. What I do see, so Bangalore for the first time has a party that is called the Navnirman Party, which is taking green issues at its center. And that's a party that's trying to contest for the elections within the city, not even the state. And, maybe at some point they'll expand to the state. So I don't know. I mean, short answer, I have no idea. I'm also very interested in seeing how this plays
out. Yeah, of course. And I mean, I suppose as issues pertaining to the environment worsen, so for example, you're talking about heat stress, water stress, I imagine the extremes will, a consequence of extreme events will also be extreme political parties arising, such as, fascist parties, but potentially also far left parties, such as, green parties, or what is traditionally seen as left. But yeah, I mean, I think a very brief story, which may be of inspiration for some viewers, is Australia's recent federal election. So we had an election in 2022. In Australia, for the past 10 years, it has had a conservative party where environmental issues were really on the back burner. I mean, you could say that for most countries in some sense, but particularly we had our Prime Minister in 2013 was a climate denier, very explicitly so. And so that sort of, you can imagine all the sort of environmental policies that would come from that. Anyways, in 2022, the left party was voted in, but more interestingly, what was about that election is that a lot of seats that were traditionally conservative seats were flipped by independent candidates. And this is very rare because usually, all the seats go to either the left or right party, never independent. But there was a wave of independent candidates. So I think about 8 independent candidates in conservative seats, which was very unusual. But even more unusual that the independent candidates, their primary policy platform was corruption, but also climate change. Those were their 2 policy aims. So, I mean, interestingly, and as a result, Australia's climate policy has improved dramatically, and they're now pushing the envelope on climate policy. But I think this is a very interesting development, how disasters as a result in 2019, the bushfires and the droughts and the floods, has a consequence of that is that people that were conservative, that never really put environmental issues in on their list of concerns, suddenly were flipping to making climate change a very primary concern. So I think that's a story that can serve as some inspiration.
That is interesting. And what I find, because we've done a lot of analysis of both media and political questions in parliamentary hour, for instance, in India, and the role of them in driving climate action or climate awareness. What you find very interesting in the Indian context is whichever party has come to power, there has never been significant climate denial. All the parties agree that climate change, or in the general public too, for instance, our media doesn't cover it from a denialist perspective. The people are aware of climate change. The challenge, I think, in India is a very different one at the political end, and it's the one that I spoke of, that when you have such a large population, of which many live in poverty, the people, whichever party it is, tends to think, focus on those priorities. How do you move economic development? And unfortunately, some of those paths, which is like widening infrastructure or industrial development, tends to come at the cost of forests. That said, so what I will say is all the major political parties over time have been including the environment more in their issues. There might not be a Green Party, but for instance, the ruling party at the center and the state, which are very different for me, in Karnataka, both of them have a significant component of climate action. So I think that's also a positive story.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I do find it very interesting of it being one of these states, these countries which has never had climate denialism, and I wonder why that is.
Yeah, well, I don't wish it into existence.
No, I don't. I mean, the same vested interests exist here, but we've never had climate denialism, so which I think is a wonderful thing.
Yeah, that's I think it's definitely something that Australia and many other countries that have had influence from think tanks and whatnot have been a very bad consequence. But interesting. Now, as a final question, Harini, I wanted to ask you, what is your outlook on the future of India's environment, its ecology?
Always positive, so because I still remain an optimist, but I'd have to say that optimism is fraying at the edges, and not necessarily only because of India alone, but because I see the effects of global change. Canada's forests, for instance. It's just that the world is dry. And so you see this in India also. Forest fires are coming fast and furious. And once you have that, you get into a loop. The Amazon, once you're getting into the tipping points, I see all these tipping points coming in. And I also see that India's growth story, at least for the next 20, 30 years, has a lot of coal. There's no way we can shift. Though we are a country that is aggressively pushing renewables, there's no way we can completely flip to coal immediately. And so that, plus the infrastructure expansion, plus the other plans for the country's economic growth, which I don't see how we can have a degrowth story, for instance, because there are all of those people to take care of. And I don't see how with a growth story we're going to protect the forests that we have. So a lot of it is politically a huge challenge. Even if you have the right thinking people and the right attitudes, there are in some of these places no win-win solutions. And so what are you going to trade off against what? And as inequity becomes, as the inequities deepen and as the effects of climate change increase, I think what you will find is it could go one of two ways. People could get together and figure out wiser ways of change, but it could also just get worse and fall apart. And I'm hoping we go, society at large and in India will go the wiser way as opposed to the falling apart way. But
absolutely. Absolutely. And if you could, if you had a utopia, in as many words or as few, what would that utopia look like?
It would be a collective of collectives. Yes, surrounded by trees and water.
I love it. Well, I mean, I'm inspired to read your books now. Thank you very much for joining me, Dr. Harini. Now, I'd like to take this opportunity. If you have any links or anything you would like to share with our viewers in regards to your books, or whatever you would like to share, please feel free to. do so.
Absolutely. If they look at my website, which is www.harininagendra, just my name.com, they can find all my books there and take a look at the books there. And if they'd like to read my scientific articles and other pieces, they can log into the Azim Premji University website, search for my name. Again, my work website will pop up, and that has a lot of links to my papers and other stuff that they can look at.
Fantastic. Well, please stay with me in the virtual green room, so to speak, Harini, but thank you so much for joining me.
It was such a pleasure, Xavier.